Thank you for that warm reception. You haven't heard what I'm going to say yet, so you should probably hold the applause, right? It's funny. It's always fun when people pronounce my name, because one time I get George Haraksin, I get George Harkinson, I get George Haraksin. That's the most one that people do. One time, and this is actually the truth, one time I was introduced as George Harassment. And you don't want to be introduced that way to start something off. George Harassment. That's what I was introduced as, but we pronounce our name Haraksin. I have some relatives who say Haraksin, so they put the accent on the first A. So. You should put a ski on there. Haraksin ski? Yeah, see. Actually, I was just in. Some of my family's from the Baltic area, Lithuania, the Baltic states, and I was just in on a cruise in the Baltic area. So I was just in Poland, by the way. I was in Germany. Wasn't allowed to go to Russia for obvious reasons, but we were in that area. So just returned from that this past June. As Pastor said, I am a former pastor. I pastor New Song Church, which is over in San Dimas. Yes, the home of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. So as a philosopher and a pastor in San Dimas, I could say Socrates. And some of you won't remember that, but I could use that term that way. And I was a pastor there for over 20 years, participated in the church for about 30 years. Left that position back in 2016, and then came and joined Reasons to Believe to partner with them, both as a speaker, and we have what's called a scholar community, where we get scholars from various disciplines, mainly the STEM fields, and we help them and equip them to have discussions about science and faith, where they're at, whether it's in the university, the lab, wherever. So if you know anyone who has a PhD in the STEM fields and might want to join us, please let me know, and I would be glad to connect them. So I serve at Reasons as well. I'm also a senior adjunct professor at Azusa Pacific University, not far from here as well. Have done that for about 20 years too. I have my wife, we just celebrated 32 years. That's why we went on the cruise. It was actually postponed because of the lockdowns. And then they canceled all the other Baltic cruises. So we were one of the last ones to get to go due to the conflict and some problems over there. I have two boys, they're adults. One is getting married next week, and I'm officiating the wedding. So that's going to be a lot of fun. I'm going to miss him as kid. All right, that's enough about me. Let's jump into our topic today. I'll put on my timer here. So we all have imaginations, right? No one left their imagination at home. If you did, we have extras in the back. No. Your imagination is a very important thing. It allows you, especially for kids, think about it. Part of their moral formation is being able to read and then empathize with a person that they don't even know in a story. It helps us to be entrepreneurs, entertainers, creative persons, write stories, but you also have an imagination that can think about things morally. So you have a moral imagination. Does that make sense to you? Right? So I want us to start our moral imagination. This will be fun. So I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. Nothing weird is going to happen, but I want you to use your imagination. Don't close them yet. I didn't say yet. I want you to imagine yourself in your own home in a beautiful kitchen, and that kitchen has a beautiful window. And I want you to be looking out at your happy place. So I don't know if your happy place is something like this, rich hills, maybe in Tuscany, Italy. Maybe you're more of a mountain person, a lake. You'd be looking out into that beautiful forest or something. Or maybe you're more of a beach type person where you want to be smell the sea air and hear the waves and things like that. So whatever your happy place is, you can now close your eyes. And there you are in your kitchen. You're looking out the window. Do you see it? What do you see? Waves? Mountains? Trees? What? Okay. So you're focused on those trees, those waves. And you're doing some dishes. And because you're in a beautiful place, you don't mind doing dishes. So with your eyes closed, you're looking out now, and you're doing dishes. Move those hands. Get those hands moving. You're washing the dishes. You're drying the dishes. And you're just having a good old time. Yes, it's dishes, but you have a beautiful view. And then suddenly you hear behind you a door crack open. And pretend you're a parent, or maybe it's your sibling, but a 4 or 5-year-old little boy or girl comes in, or it's your brother or sister, and they walk in, and you're busy looking out that window, doing the dishes, and they say this to you, keep your eyes closed, they say, "Can I play with this?" What do you say? Do you automatically say no? Go ahead? What are you thinking? You might be thinking, well, what is it? If it's a fire engine and you want to pretend to be a fireman, yeah, go right ahead. Is it a tool from the garage? Well, maybe. Is it the neighbor's cat? Okay. Is it the local rattlesnake? Oh, no. Right? Now do it again. Keep your eyes closed. You're looking out that beautiful window. And again, you hear that door creak, and in comes that younger brother or sister or your son or daughter, and they say, "Mommy, Daddy, brother, sis, can I eat this?" Now, keep your eyes closed. Okay. Now what do you say? Why no? What if it's Cheerios? It's probably not Cheerios. I know my kids. I know my brother or sister. If it's Cheerios, yeah, go right ahead. If it's a dead lizard, like kind of maybe a little gross, but maybe it won't hurt you. It might be a little crunchy. Is it Drano from the garage? Absolutely not. You can't drink or eat that, right? One last one. Keep your eyes closed. You're there. You're looking at that beautiful landscape, the beach, the mountains, the hills. You hear that door creak again. The young person comes in and says, "Can I kill this?" What do you say? What if it's a little pill bug? Still no. What if it's a spider? Light it. Let's not go to our dark side, okay? What if it's the neighbor's cat? And that cat keeps you up late at night. I heard a couple of yeses. All right. What if they're holding their very young baby brother or sister? Of course not. And we're calling the psychiatrist right away, and we're going to go down and see them. Right? What's the common denominator in each of these questions? What do you have to ask? You have to ask, what is it? And this one simple question is something that's very helpful to narrow and simplify the issue of abortion. Now, it can grow more complex than this. Totally admit that. But this is a question that focuses us into it. I mean, just listen to our own answers. When I ratchet it up pretty quickly, you're like, well, yes, maybe not, and a no, right? So we have to ask, well, what is it? Tonight, the topic, as was stated, ethical concerns about abortion and the value of human life. Now, please note the title. Notice these are ethical concerns or moral concerns. I don't have time to do with you what I might do with my students, where we would go through each of the arguments, whether they're pro-life, whether they're pro-choice or pro-abortion, however you want to describe it. We don't have time to go through those. We can do those during the question and answer time. That's great. So we just don't have time to go through all of them. I'll touch on some of them. But I want to share some concerns, to raise some moral concerns that I have, and hopefully equip you on how to engage or deal with this issue. Right? Now, I'm not going to assume that everyone holds the same view. I just don't know. I don't know everyone, obviously. And what I really want to seek, and I borrow this from someone, is I want to seek clarity over agreement first. Right? Let's get clear on the issue before we try to persuade and make each other agree with us. Okay? Does that make sense to you? Right? So it's a way to not try to needlessly persuade someone too quickly to say, well, this is the truth and you have to believe it. It's a process, okay? So when you just define the word abortion, this is just a snapshot from dictionary.com. Everyone see that okay, or decently? So they give a quick clarification. There's a difference between a voluntary abortion and a spontaneous abortion. On the first definition here, on voluntary abortion. It says, it is the removal of an embryo or fetus from the uterus in order to end a pregnancy, right? So just so you know, I'm not begging a question or tilting a definition in one way or another. This is just from dictionary.com, all right? But I want you to notice just a couple of things. I do this for a living, so these things pop out at me. They may not pop out at you. I'm also a drummer, and so I'm a professional drummer. I'll be playing in Covina at Naviz this Saturday, if you want to, so it was really weird when I used to play drums for the church. I would get out and then come preach, and people were like, what? Mind blown. The pastor has rhythm, crazy. When you look at this, certain things, as a musician, certain things pop out at me. I can hear them, and especially with drummers, and I can see things. Not everyone can see the details, but let me point out a couple to you. Notice this word, removal, right? What do you think of when you hear the word removal? Say it louder for me. I'm a drummer, I can't hear. Take something away, right? I have an old couch. I called the waste department. Hey, come take it, remove it, right? If I said to a friend here, I'm going to remove you from the room. Okay, well, that's a little bit more serious. Why are you removing me from the room? If I say, I'm removing you from the planet, that ratchets it up a bit. So that's somewhat of an ambiguous word, something to take notice of. These two words, embryo and fetus, what is that? If we had time, I would ask you to say, what feeling, what emotion do you have? What definition do you have of that? And it turns out that these are really come from a Latin derivative, which just means stages of development or maturity. So it's like we would say, well, that's an infant, or that's a toddler, or that's a teenager, or that's an adult. Those are stages of maturity, and that's what these are as well. But today they're often heard, it comes through the filter of our mind, as sort of ambiguous labels, okay? One more, look at this word, end. Now, if I said, my job's coming to an end, we kind of know what that means. It could be sad, it could be a good thing. If I say, like, my kids, when two boys will mess around, it's like, I'm gonna end you. Right? Now that has a different connotation to it, right? Probably said in a tongue-in-cheek manner, but if the local mob boss, Jeff, says it, I'm gonna end you now. Right? Now that's weighty. Right? So we want to not let certain words just pass by us too quickly. They can point us in certain directions, move us, massage us in certain directions on issues. Now, why talk about this issue? Why show up? Why talk about this? Let me suggest 4 things. It's core, it's current, it's common, and it's part of our calling. Okay? Let's take the first one. It's core. What do I mean by that? I teach on the abortion issue every semester, and the reason is it goes to some of the core questions of life. I remember Fuzz last week, who was here, Dr. Rana, and when he was talking to us, he opened up with the first question. What's the most important question you can ask yourself? Now, I thought he was going to say, what's better, Star Trek or Star Wars? And that really stirs people up. But he said, no, who am I? What am I? What's my purpose in life? And the abortion issue gets to those exact things. What is the unborn entity? What is it? It goes to our first imagination that we went through. What makes human beings valuable? Is it belly buttons? Some have innie, some have outie. That's not probably what makes us valuable. Is it something intrinsic, or is it some function that we have? If you're smart, you're valuable. That raises that question. What are our duties to human beings? What are our responsibilities? You didn't choose to have a brother or sister in many cases, if you do have one, and you have certain responsibilities and duties to them, even though you didn't necessarily choose them, right? So some obligations and duties in life aren't necessarily chosen. That raises some particular issues when it comes to abortion. You can go further. Ethics is just not about what's my duty, but we can also ask this: what would a virtuous, good person do in this situation? A lot of times people will say, well, it's my free choice, or I have the freedom to do this. Well, that could be true in a number of cases. However, what would a virtuous person do? A person that we might have in mind, again, using our moral imagination. Who is a good person? How do I become that good person? What does it take to be that good person? All of these gets wrapped up into the abortion issue. Now, of course, this issue is current as well. And many of us know this if we are not fasting from media or something like that. Notice that people think about this all the time. In fact, whether you knew it or not, state legislatures, policymakers, over the last 5-6 years have been anticipating an overturning, potentially, of Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court decision in 1973. So with that, certain states make have laws where they're going to kick in. So if that's overturned, that particular state would be a state where you could have an abortion all the way up to 9 months of pregnancy. Okay? Other states went the other way. They either had laws on the books that were unenforceable because of Roe v. Wade, and then if it's overturned, they would be enforceable, or some had what they called trigger laws. That is, to restrict or even ban abortion if Roe v. Wade is overturned. So we have happened in June, it was leaked earlier, but the Dobbs decision of the Supreme Court. What this does is this moves, it says, the Constitution doesn't explicitly point to a right to an abortion. So it's not a constitutional right, but it sends it back over to the states for them then to decide. So the states are meant to be like little laboratories, or in California's case, a big laboratory, that allows us to experiment to some degree on what allows for promoting human flourishing, for certain freedoms. And states make different decisions about those things. And so it's turned over to the states to decide in this particular case. A lot of people, we talk about the Supreme Court being the highest court in the land. Did you know that that's not true? Does anyone know why? It's because there's a basketball court in the Supreme Court. Right above the chambers is actually a basketball court. And I love the idea of the justices, one-on-one or, having a basketball game with one another, right? So this is also very common. It affects half, more of the population directly, others indirectly. Right? It's throughout our movies. Go all the way back to the 80s. Dirty Dancing has a theme, a subplot to it. The Cider House Rules is about an older and a younger abortion doctor. You have the comedy, although dealing with very serious adult subjects, Juno, about a crisis pregnancy. The movie Unplanned came out a few years ago about a woman who moved up in the ranks to oversee a Planned Parenthood clinic and then saw something that made her walk away. How many have seen the movie Gosnell? I don't see a hand. How many know of the Dr. Gosnell? Okay, about 2 of you. We should take note that it's interesting that about 2 of us in this room only know about it, yet arguably he's according to the way this movie shows it going into the court case that happened, the most mass murderer in U.S. history. Right? He was put on trial for butchering, basically, abortions, killing women and infants. Yet none of us have heard of him. Why is that? Regardless of your position, why is that the case today? You can see it throughout hip-hop music, rap music. You can trace a line. I just read an article tracing the line of how this topic is dealt with through song. Some of them are powerful, very intense, brought tears to my eyes. Now, you can ask, if it's so common, who's having abortions? Now, we don't have time to go through this piece by piece, but you see here, we have some of the most full and robust data that at 2014, about 1 in 4 women, 24%, will have an abortion by the age of 45. So 1 in 4, 1 in 5, about 1 in 5 women. That's a lot. More than half of the U.S. abortion patients in 2014 were in their 20s. Patients aged 22 to 24 obtained 34% of all abortions, and patients aged 25 through 29 obtained 27%. Right? So when you're younger, there's about almost over half of the abortions. Okay? And you probably for some obvious reasons why. What might be of more interest, or at least an emphasis as we're here in the church, one should know that 17% of abortion patients in 2014 identified themselves as mainline Protestants, 13% as evangelical Protestants, and 24% as Catholic. Even though the Catholic Church has a strong stance formally on being pro-life, it's interesting that 24% of Catholic women have had an abortion. Then 38% reported no affiliation. Now, in a room like this, if it's this common, that means someone here has either had an abortion, knows someone who has had one, or is connected to it in some way, shape, or form. Right? And I always like to mention as a pastor, when we go through different things in life, when we make a good choice, we can celebrate. When we make a bad choice, we might feel guilt, shame, or that. But on the Christian view of things, we serve a very, very just, but also loving and forgiving God, and that brings a lot of hope. And so I want to be sensitive when dealing about this to know that emotionally it can be very, very impactful, but that should give us a clue that something important is going on here, that it's not something minor. Finally, it's our calling. For those who are Jews, I would say especially Christians, we have places in the Old and New Testament that should convict us to want to seek justice, right? Isaiah, you may know the verse, learn to do what is right, promote justice, give the oppressed a reason to celebrate, have hope, work on behalf of the oppressed, the orphan, defend the righteous, those who are most vulnerable in one's society. Notice this also, it says learn. That's wonderful. We don't have to know it all. Well, I know it all. Just kidding. My kids remind me that I don't all the time. It's a process. We have to look at one another and know that we're on a journey, even in our moral knowledge and our moral application. And that's why we have to be patient and wrestle with these things with one another. Okay? Now, it's also interesting. I was up in Berkeley not a while ago, and one sign said, "This is a no-hate zone." Okay? Now, I can somewhat understand what they mean, right? We don't want actions of hate. But then as a philosopher, I just start to go off the rails, right? I'm like, are they trying to control people's thoughts? Or people who hate butter pecan ice cream? Or pistachio, I pick whatever you hate as ice cream. But aren't we supposed to hate some things that are evil? Take slavery, a terrible institution. And we should hate it. In fact, it's very interesting that the Bible itself says, you who love the Lord should hate evil. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil. Now, if we take that seriously, that doesn't follow that I hate the person. But we are to say certain actions promote evil, and we should have very certain types of feelings about those. So here's the question I pose to you. You don't have to say it out loud. You don't have to answer it out loud. But is it ever justified to take the life of the unborn entity? Of course, we're talking about human entities here. A human egg and a human sperm unite to form an embryo. And we recognize that that is a new entity. Okay? And it has a particular goal it's supposed to develop into. Now, how would you, again, you don't have to say it out loud, but how would you answer this question? I'm going to suggest to you that there's 4 answers, and there's different kinds of justification for them. So just I'm trying to make it a little bit more simple to get a hold of. So here are the 4 answers. What do you think the first one is? No. Right? Some of you said it when I said, can I eat this? And you just said no. Right? Some say no. So there is a pro-life position that says abortion, is never justified. this is a much more of a minority position, and we'll see why in a moment. But be on the lookout that usually in popular literature, in broadcast too, when people start to talk about the pro-life position, they limit it to this position that provides no exemptions. So it can make it look like there's only one view on the pro-life side. The other view would be this. I would say a qualified no, that's pro-life. This person who has a qualified no says that, generally speaking, abortion is unjustified. But in a few cases, when the mother's life is in danger, such as an ectopic or tubal pregnancy, the embryo is lodged in a place where it can't grow. And so both the embryo will die, the human embryo will die, and the mother will die. So the posture or the principle is if we can save both, we would, but we don't have the technology to. So if instead of losing two, it's appropriate, justified to save one. If we could, we'd save both. But in this case, we can only save the mother. Now, scientists are working on external wombs, but that's for another time, and Fuzz can talk about that. There's a third position that I would call a qualified yes. These persons tend to identify as pro-abortion or pro-choice, and what they argue is that we need to open up the funnel a bit more. There's much more cases than the number two position where we should provide for abortion, but they are not for what's called abortion on demand for any reason that the woman or the mother brings up. Okay, does that make sense to you? Right. The fourth one is where the person says always, that for any reason the mother can choose to end the pregnancy. These two in the middle account for somewhere between 60 to 70% of people in the United States. Okay? So these two positions, 1 and 4, are more minority positions. One of my concerns is how much position 4 is growing. And, but these two positions, what happens, some sociologists call this the squishy middle, is that people kind of move back and forth from how many cases they will allow, and they're not fully consistent on their views. Okay, so these I would say are the 4 different views. Now notice, as I said, these two are going to be where most people are at, and I think we should keep that in mind. And we can ask clarifying questions to see where someone is at. You can ask them, "Hey, do you ever think is it ever justified to take the life of the unborn?" What would you say? You know, they might say something more like sometimes or whatever, and you can sort of put them in these different positions and then ask, okay, how do you justify that? What are your reasons for that? Now, when you hear me asking for reasons, whenever you deal with moral issues, remember, we as humans combine the intellectual and the emotional. But sometimes we have to separate them to a degree so that we can wrestle with it without getting overly heated. When my wife and I have a quarrel, she actually gets more, I call her, she goes into lawyer mode, and she actually gets more logical than I do, and I get all emotional, like an emotional drummer, and I always tell her, you know, if you want to use logic, I don't want to chit-chat. You know? But we recognize that we have to be able to set aside our emotions for a little bit to deal with it intellectually. So the intellectual issues are us wrestling with it rationally, intellectually. The emotional side deals with the burdens or sometimes the joys of the issues. And I recognize that in human beings, those go together, but we can be disciplined to separate them in certain, and that's what I'm trying to do tonight. So if I give you a view and you're not emotionally satisfied with it, sometimes that happens, right? We can find out the truth, but our emotions haven't caught up with it yet. So we should be mindful of that. Now, I heard someone when I was hanging out earlier that, of course, they give me the easy topics. You know, Fuzz got to talk about biochemistry. Let me tell you, biochemistry is way harder, I think. But I heard someone say, well, this is a complex issue. And in some ways it is, but actually I think you can simplify it. And I want to make a distinction, and this will be really helpful to you. There's a distinction between something being psychologically complex and then morally complex. Right? I get home from the doctor. The doctor says, you can't eat sweets for 6 months. Right? And my wife just baked a beautiful, buttercream cake, frosting everywhere. And I'm looking at the cake, and I know what the right thing to do is. Anyone with me here? I want to eat the cake. I'm going to eat the cake. The cake will be mine. I love the cake. But I know what's right. It's morally simple what I need to do. But it's psychologically and emotionally what? Complex. It's difficult. On one side, I know intellectually what the doctor said. I know what I need to do. But I love the cake. I love the cake. This happens in all sorts of moral issues. A lot of times, a parent might love their kid, but right now, they don't like them. You might love your parent, but you don't like them right now. You know what the right thing to do is to keep loving them, even though you got to work through that dislike, right? So some things can be morally simple. And I actually think that the abortion issue can be simplified in a lot of cases, like our earlier question. Can I kill this? Well, what is it? Fairly straightforward. So the abortion issue is not, this is my claim, the abortion issue is not always morally complex, though it is, please hear this, psychologically complex, emotionally weighty, comes with personal burdens, sacrifices sometimes. Also, it can come with joy, hope, and love. So we should recognize this in dealing with it intellectually and emotionally. Now, Greg Kokel is a Christian apologist. We were actually in school together, graduate school, at one particular time, and he simplifies it this way. He says, if the unborn are not human persons, no justification for abortion is necessary. However, if the unborn is a human person, no justification for abortion is adequate. Notice the asterisks. He takes a qualified no position. Okay? What he is saying here is, look, I'm open to being convinced. If that entity growing inside the woman, if it's not what I think it is, and it's more like a kidney or a tumor or something else, okay, I might have to give up my claim, my view. However, if it is a human person, you better have a really good reason for ending a human person's life. That's his claim. So it centers around that question. Now, I want to clarify one other thing, and I think this will be helpful too. Otherwise, obviously, I wouldn't put it in the talk, right? Is there a right to choose? Is there a right to choose? I'm kind of saying it rhetorically, but I don't mean it rhetorically. Is there a right to choose? I once saw a car. Over here it says, I'm pro-choice America, but over here it says, boycott veal, stop factory farming. So we're pro-choice here, but not about eating or farming veal. Now, I really wanted to hang out and see if the person came to the car and just wonder if they've ever thought about the contradiction, right? It would be interesting. I actually walked out of a coffee shop once, saw a car, and it had a bumper sticker that said, challenge everything. And so I waited because I wanted to talk to the person, and they didn't come out. And so I wanted to grab my Sharpie, my briefcase, and cross it out and write, I challenge that. They never came out. But I figured an ethicist shouldn't be graffitiing other people's cars, so I didn't do it. My kids were playing a game from Electronic Arts, EA Games. Their slogan comes up, EA Games, challenge everything. And I pause it. And they're like, why do you do it, Dad? Let's play the game. And I said, if it says challenge everything, well, shouldn't we challenge that? And they're like, yeah, we should challenge that. And then the next day, I hear them playing the game. EA Games, challenge everything. And I hear this from the other room. Yeah, challenge that. Right? We got to think these things through. Sometimes we let them pass a little quickly. It goes back to this question. You got to fill in the blank, right? Is there a right to choose? Well, the right to choose, I would argue, is an incomplete right. You have to fill in the blank. Can or should I choose X? I believe in the right to choose your spouse, right? Not arranged marriages. The right to choose your own car. Yeah. The right to choose your own vocation. Yeah. The right to choose to beat up my sister. And I wanted to a couple of times, right? No, I don't have the right to choose that. There are some, the right to choose to own a slave? No, of course not, right? So the right to choose, I think, is an incomplete right, though that phrase gets put out very, very often. So let me give you a pro-life argument, and then we'll look at a family of pro-choice arguments, okay? If you don't want to say pro-choice, the words are hard to get away from. They're just what we're familiar with, but I'm trying to raise some issues with them, some concerns. So here's an argument. Now, I'm a philosopher. I actually don't think arguments are boring. I think that we use them all the time against one another in school, all over the place. So we just want to learn how to do it well. So the unborn entity from the moment of conception is a full-fledged member of the human community. This is premise one. This comes from Frank Beckwith, who's a moral philosopher. Premise two, it is a prima facie. That just means a fairly obvious or intuitively obvious. It seems on the surface. That's what prima facie means. It seems to be an obvious fact that it's morally wrong to kill any member of that community. Every successful abortion kills an unborn entity, a full-fledged member of the human community. Therefore, the conclusion follows, every successful abortion is prima facie morally wrong. Here's how I would sum it up. What he is trying to say is that we shouldn't, if the unborn entity is part of the human community, if we have a box and that is who we put in the human community, if we can put that entity there, then you better have a really, really good reason to end its life. That's the force of the argument. Is that making sense to you? If not, write something down or give a challenge at the question and answer time. Now, Jerome Lejeune, a very famous geneticist and pediatrician, discovered some of the connections for Down syndrome to trisomy, said to accept the fact that after fertilization has taken place, a new human has come into being is no longer a matter of taste or opinion, he argues. The human nature of the human being from conception to old age is not a philosophical or metaphysical contention anymore. It is plain experimental evidence. So he's saying from a scientific, experimental point of view, it's very difficult to deny the humanity of the unborn. Now, I'm going to show you a video. How many have heard of the procedure called embryoscopy? Oh, you have? Very, very good. Are you in the medical field? Yeah. You're a nurse? Yeah, bingo. Even some of the nurses that I teach at school, a lot of them haven't heard of it, but instead of a sonogram or an ultrasound, which is less invasive, they've actually been able to take like a fiber optic camera and actually live record the developmental process from conception on. And so what you're going to see here is that at the beginning stages, the human skin is so thin, it's like it's invisible and you can see everything. And you can see, this is just a minute long, but you can get a feel for this. This comes from the Endowment for Human Development.
By 4 weeks, the clear amnion surrounds the embryo in a fluid-filled sac. This sterile liquid, called amniotic fluid, provides the embryo with protection from injury. The heart typically beats about 113 times per minute. Note how the heart changes color as blood enters and leaves its chambers with each beat. The heart will beat approximately 54 million times before birth and over 3.2 billion times over the course of an 80-year lifespan. Rapid brain growth is evidenced by the changing appearance of the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. Upper and lower limb development begins with the appearance of the limb buds by 4 weeks. The skin is transparent at this point because it is only 1 cell thick. As the skin thickens, it will lose this transparency, which means that we will only be able to watch internal organs develop for about another month.
So we could go on and I could describe, and perhaps our nurse friend would describe it even better than me, at the different stages what we now know, what we now can discover. It's pretty amazing. We can tell things like right-handed and left-handedness while they're in the room, how they turn, their ability to turn, sucking the thumb, all sorts of things that would fascinate you, and it's especially impactful visually. Now that's not an argument. That impacts us more on the emotional side, but is it empirically true? At 4 weeks there, many women don't know that they're pregnant yet, right? Most abortions happen within the first 3 months, okay? With that, we can ask this question then. What's the difference between the unborn human organism and the born human organism? I don't mean the movie, The Bourne Identity, just the born. And there seems to be no morally relevant difference, and there's something known as the SLED test. I would highly recommend for you to write this down because it's a very easy way, a memory technique to remember this, and you can dialogue with the person fairly quickly. My wife did this with a paralegal that she was flying with, and she put on a notebook and went through the SLED test and talked about her objections, and they went through them. At the end of the plane ride, they were about to get up, and the lawyer said, she goes, "Man, I think I'm wrong." And she says, "But I can't change my view." She was pro-abortion. And my wife said, "Well, why?" And she said, "Because everyone in the office won't like me." And so it's a very deep emotional burden because it's hard when people don't like you or disparage you, right? Now, the SLED test goes like this. My wife used it, you can use it too. S stands for size. Yes, there's a difference between the born and the unborn, and they're different in size. However, does that justify taking away any basic rights or ending a life? My son, when he was a toddler, was a lot smaller than Shaquille O'Neal. Okay? But do they have different basic human rights or right to life? Size is not enough justification to determine that. L is level of development. It is true that the unborn are less developed, less mature than the infant or the toddler or the teenager, even as we grow into adulthood. But does our level of development determine our basic rights? It doesn't seem to be the case. It's not enough justification. E stands for environment, or to put it another way, where you are doesn't determine who you are. If you are in spaceflight, you go to Mars, you go to the moon, that doesn't change your identity, Neil Armstrong. Right? Where you are doesn't determine who you are. Also, D is for degree of dependency. The unborn are very much more dependent on the woman, the mother, than, let's say, a teenager. No comments from anybody. An infant or a toddler is still dependent on parents or other people in their lives. But does our degree of dependency determine our rights or justify ending our life? People are on dialysis. Astronauts have certain mechanisms that keep them alive when they're in space. So that doesn't take away our rights either. So size, level of development, environment, degree of dependency. Those don't seem, oh, you mean I've got all that down, but I'll leave it there. Those don't seem to be enough justification to justify arguably ending the life of the unborn. Now you can ask questions about that and we can challenge it. In fact, let me bring up a couple of challenges as we conclude here. There are basically, I would put it down to three kinds or three families of arguments arguing on behalf of the pro-choice or the pro-abortion position, right? That's the qualified yes and the always, right? Is everyone with me here? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and not, okay, good. There are appeals to privacy. This is what the Roe v. Wade case tended to do or tended to lean on. There are appeals to autonomy, something similar to my body, my choice type of argument. They get more sophisticated than that. And let me just take those two just for right now. I'll give you the third one in just a moment as I finish. When pastors say, as we conclude, that means there's 30 more minutes. Right. Yeah, fair? Yeah, okay. No, there's not 30 more minutes. These two, don't get confused, but appeals to autonomy and appeals to privacy. These two end up following two kinds of arguments. Appeals to pity and appeals to tolerance. Okay? Now, by appeal to pity, that's a known term in logic. We are appealing to our compassion, our empathy, right? Why would we force a young woman who's got her whole life ahead of her to carry a child to term and raise that? Doesn't that seem unjust? Right? And you might think, well, yeah, that appeals to one's emotion. And there can be good reason to appeal to emotion. Don't hear me say that appeals to emotion are wrong, right? How many times have we seen maybe a picture or an advertisement about someone in a country where they lack food or access to water, and you see those persons and their plight. Take Ukraine, the pictures that we see coming out of there. Those are important appeals for us to have compassion and empathy. However, what I suggest to you, and you can ask questions to challenge or to clarify, is that appeals to pity, and I'll put them up here. We don't have time to go through all of them. I mentioned that in the beginning. Whoops. Appeals to pity, generally speaking, avoid, please hear me, they avoid addressing what it is. Take something like equal access. If we ban abortion, then rich persons can fly to other countries or other places or to states that do promote or give access to abortion. Rich people will be able to have them, but poor people will not. And we naturally would go, well, that's unfair. However, if you are dealing in a case where a rich person is doing something wrong, embezzling money from the company, we don't usually reason this way. Well, poor people should be able to embezzle money too. So let's give them equal access. When someone's doing something wrong, we don't try to help other people do something wrong. Now, you would say, but you're assuming that abortion is wrong. I would say, well, you might be assuming that abortion is right. Let's talk about what it is, not about rich or poor in this particular case, but what is it, and should we be making this choice? Okay. If I had time, and we can bring them up during the questions, I'd go through each of these and show you that they avoid the question of what it is, and they assume that either it's not a human being or they just don't address it. Okay? Appeals to tolerance, a couple of them. Can't we just agree to disagree? Now, that's about where we are right now, if you think about it, right? We've moved the decision to the states, so we're going to have, right now, we're kind of, certain states are agreeing to disagree with other states and placing in their policies, right? California is talking about being sort of a safe zone where they'll have to pay for people to come, right? Other states are placing higher restrictions. So in some cases we can do that, but when we're talking about a morally weighty issue, try using that argument, let's say, and I'm not trying to be crass here or belittle anything. I want you to feel the power of it. What if you said, well, can't we just agree to disagree about slavery? That wouldn't come across well, because it's such a morally weighty issue that we have to come to terms with it and make some decisions. Okay? The appeal to tolerance, and I call it don't push me, but it's like don't legislate your morality on me. Friends, we do that all the time, right? Don't take my computer. Stop forcing your morality on me, right? That's just part of life. So we should accept that, but wrestle with the issue, what is it? And are there justifications for ending its life? There are other more sophisticated cases. Judith Jarvis Thompson, which informed a number of Supreme Court decisions, talked about the violinist argument. It goes like this. A woman wakes up to find she's been attached without her consent to a famous violinist who needs the help of her kidneys for the next 9 months in order to live. If the woman detaches herself from him, he will die. Now, doesn't the woman there have the right to autonomy? Is it fair for her to be hooked up to the violinist against her will? I mean, could you imagine being hooked up to somebody and they have to use partly your body for 9 months? And you can see the parallel. And it's a forceful parallel. This really fits well in cases of, let's say, rape or incest when a pregnancy happens. Is it fair for that woman who didn't consent to any type of sexual relationship, is it fair for them to bring that child to term and face all of those burdens and sacrifices? Right? Now, we could talk about the differences or problems here with the analogy. For analogies to work, please hear me on this, for analogies to work, they have to be close and tight. The more you can show that there's a disanalogy, the less strength the argument has. So in this case, if we make the parallel to abortion, it seems closest to cases of rape and incest. But however, in abortion, what would be happening here in this parallel is you're not just unplugging the unborn, what are you doing? You're ending its life or taking its life. It would be like unplugging the violinist and then stabbing him. So is that really a parallel? This is I would say, a forceful argument, but if you're a pro-life person, to argue against it, you have to show that there's a disanalogy. Okay, just an example. Even in our law, the Supreme Court, one of the decisions, the Casey decision, in the commentary on it, here's what the justices wrote. Now look at the language very carefully. They say, at the heart of liberty, we're for liberty, is the right to define one's own existence. Concept of one's own existence, meaning to define your place in the universe and of the mystery of human life. Beliefs about these matters could not define the attributes of personhood were they formed under the compulsion of the state. So it's saying here, to translate, you get to define your existence, meaning of life, what's good or bad, all that's your own personal liberty. But notice again, we wouldn't accept this. This is very philosophical. It's not so much law in this case. And that's why, in part, the justices overturned Roe, which implied the overturning of Casey, because this reasoning doesn't seem to hold up. Because you could use this reasoning to do other bad things, like own a slave, right? I define my existence as having certain other people serve me. That doesn't follow. We don't stand for that. So we have appeals to privacy, appeals to autonomy. Here's the one I'm most concerned about. This is the appeal to person rights over human rights. As Greg Koukl wrote once, he says, this is the literal death of humanness. What is going on here? Let me give you a quote from David Boonen's book, which is probably the best book, if you want to read it, on a defense of abortion. And here's what he says. Please listen to his words carefully. He opens up the book this way. He says, on the desk in my office where most of this book was written and revised, there is several pictures of my son, Eli. My younger son is named Elias. So, in one, he is gleefully dancing on the sand along the Gulf of Mexico. The cool ocean breeze wreaking havoc with his wispy hair. Kind of makes you smile. In the top drawer of my desk, I keep another picture of Eli. The picture was taken on September 7, 1993, 24 weeks before he was born. The sonogram image is murky, but it reveals clearly enough a small head tilted back slightly and an arm raised up and bent, with the hand pointing back toward the face and the thumb extended toward the mouth. There is no doubt in my mind that this picture too shows me the same little boy at the early stage of his physical development. And there is no question that the position I defend in this book entails that it would have been morally permissible to end his life at this point. So what Boonin argues, and he tries to justify in his book, is that regardless if it's a human being, what we established earlier, there still are justifications to end the life. That's why it's the death of humanists. Now, I'm told, and I've heard from Frank Beckwith in that David Boonin is a really good, nice guy. So I don't want to be pejorative or anything about him, but that's a very weighty passage. So let me take it one step further, and this is the last one. The shift of the debate the focus of the debate has shifted, my friends. And now we're going to be talking about person rights, not human rights. And what the argument is this. In 2012, two Italian philosophers by the name of Giubilini and Minerva, those are great Italian names, by the way, Giubilini, wrote a paper entitled Afterbirth Abortion. So what they argue, and I kind of have a little bit of a lengthy quote, but I want you to hear it so you don't think that I'm making it up or twisting it in any sort of way. One thing we want to do at RTB is make sure we treat others who are making arguments fairly, that we don't build up a straw man and knock it down. Here's what they argue. They argue that the pro-abortion logic that justifies many of our laws today, even internationally, leads to the justification of afterbirth abortion. So this is after literal birth. Here's what they argue. Euthanasia in infants has been proposed by philosophers for children with abnormalities. And notice the language, whose lives can be expected to be not worth living. Further, they say medical professionals, they need boundaries and they need to know what's in the best interest of the child. Okay? Further, nonetheless, they say to bring up certain children, for instance, children with Down syndrome, might be an unbearable burden on the family and on the society as a whole. Please notice this. When the state economically provides for their care, libertarians and conservatives are leery about, and I don't mean that as partisan, I mean that as political philosophies. Okay, so please hear me. They are concerned when the state or the government takes over health care because you can have certain arguments that justify ending life whether you want it to end or not. Further, they argue about this. We actually have an experiment of this in Iceland. Iceland has reduced Down syndrome, babies born of Down syndrome to almost nothing. There's only like 1 or 2 babies born. And it's mostly done because you can identify when the unborn are Down syndrome, and most women choose to end their pregnancies if they have a Down syndrome kid. So you can eliminate Down syndrome, but it's done in this particular way. So finally, they say, therefore, we claim that killing a newborn could be ethically permissible in all the circumstances where abortion would be. Such circumstances include cases where the newborn has the potential to have at least an acceptable life, but the well-being of the family is at risk. So essentially, others are determining whether one's life is livable or not, and determining for another human whether or not your life is worth living. And that's that fourth position, not only always through the 9 months of pregnancy, but it extends, in some cases, some philosophers will extend it to the first 18 months. I'm going to skip some of there. So what we have here now is a separation of person from being human. This also enables some animal rights activists to argue that some animals are persons even though they're not human, so they deserve the same kinds of rights as well. So if you make this move of separating person and human, these other arguments come into play as well. I'm going to finish here. Greg Kokel, in one of his arguments, says we've become velocitized. Have you ever driven fast on the freeway? No one would do that. But you get used to driving fast. Pilots know this. And then when you pull over and slow down, it feels like you're still going fast. It feels like you're going really too slow. You get adjusted to the speed. Arguably, we are getting adjusted in our culture that would move us to entertain more regularly things such as infanticide. And that's just not out there now in some philosophical journal. Due to social media and other things, it's becoming more widespread and faster. And so that's a weighty and serious thing to think about. Francis Schaeffer once said this: what was unthinkable yesterday is thinkable today, and ordinary and commonplace tomorrow. It's interesting. I will raise this subject with my students, and I start to, can I eat this? Can I play with this? Can I kill this? And they will say, it's changed over the last 20 years. When I say a pill bug or a spider, more and more of them say, no. You can't. Of course not a cat or anything else. But they say yes to abortion, interestingly. Let me close with this. Let us not become weary of doing good. At the proper time, we will reap a harvest if we don't give up. Therefore, as we have the opportunity, let us do to all people. We have to learn to talk about this, learn to argue in a good way about it, but we should be very sober about the different positions and where they lead. Thank you. I hope you don't feel like this right now. It's possible you might, but also my colleagues, I'll be remiss if I don't mention, we want to give you, if you're interested, we have a free book, a free giveaway out at the table of one of the books that talks about building bridges with other people on these various types of issues. So if you go to our table, scan this QR code, we'll get that book in your hands if you'd like.
Wow. I think this is the best presentation I've heard on this ever.
Wow. Well, thank you.
So thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to do questions and answer time. Parents, your kids are in the back. So you might want to take your kids outside. So I don't know, I'm not quite sure what kind of questions will be asked, but just be aware of that. Okay, so how we're going to do this, raise your hand if you have a question, and it should be in the form of a question, okay? Meaning that if you have a comment or a statement that adds to the conversation, we want to hear that. But this isn't an opportunity for you to platform. That's what Facebook is for. And you can have your own YouTube channel. But we want to add value to the conversation. So if you have a question or if you have a comment that will add or lead to the question, or do you think that might help us to have a better understanding of what George went through, that would be very, very helpful. I'll tell you what, I'll start. I have been asked this question from the other side. It's just a bunch of cells at conception. And I know you showed the heart beating at what, 4 months? Or 4 weeks. Sorry, 4 weeks, which is kind of, that one's hard. I would like to see just less abortions, right? So is there, clearly life begins at conception. Is there any compromise in that gray area, or is there gray area?
Well, remember the Isaiah passage.
Yeah.
We're supposed to learn.
Yeah.
So certainly, philosophers call it epistemology, how we know things.
Yeah.
There can be gray areas in our epistemology, how we know. I just may not know where to go. I may not know the facts. So if someone says, well, look, it's just a clump of cells. Right. And I go, well, if that's the case, then no justification for abortion is necessary. And they might be surprised to hear you say that. But I would suggest, if it's not just a clump of cells, then we need a really good justification, especially if it's a part of the human community. Would you be willing for us to look at various scientific textbooks and others that talk about the biology and development? I mean, I don't know of a case where we take a human sperm and a human egg and get corn, or get kittens, or we know inductively what it comes into.
That's a good point.
So that would
That's a
be
great
one start way.
That's a great point. What has my head spinning is this personhood, human being dilemma that we're finding ourselves in, which will probably be a bigger issue in the coming years than it is right now. Is it even worth having that argument with somebody that is not a believer or that is pro-choice, arguing for personhood rights for an unborn person? I mean, they're not going to buy the cell thing, but at a certain point, the fetus, it's a baby, and it has feelings, and it has emotions, and it has fight or flight reflexes.
Sure.
So, can we make those type of arguments, or should we not go?
No,
go down that path?
No, I think yes, we need to. What I tried to do tonight was share the concerns so that we would be, and even for those that might disagree, we would be equipped that this is where the arguments are shifting, and that we should be equipped to be able to deal with them and to educate ourselves to deal with them. So, and especially for Christians, think about our view. We believe that there's a God, three persons, one God, three who's, one what. So there are persons that are not humans. Angels could be persons and not humans. So it is a fair distinction to make, but one needs to make the argument, can you actually separate human person? I would argue you can't separate those two. For instance, one analogy, a triangle has what? 3 sides, but it has more than that. 3 angles, what? That add up to 180 as 3 points. Angles, sides, points. We can abstract those as lines, points, angles, and say that, well, these things, we can talk about them abstractly, but I've never seen a triangle with 4 points. Yeah. They always go together. And so what I would argue is that all human entities are persons with great potential. They're not potential persons. So I would want a justification from my friend or the person making the case. Why should I separate humanhood and personhood? Why is that a justified point? And I think we should be equipped to deal with that. I didn't have time to fully go through it here, but that we do go through it in my class.
I shouldn't ask this question. All right, let's ask questions. There we go.
So you didn't mention anything. Wait.
You didn't mention anything about demographics, but there's, I think, 60 million souls who are not living or haven't lived in the United States, and that's certainly affected the way the United States is. So what about that issue? Is there any way to approach that issue? That's my question, I guess.
Let me make sure I'm clear on the question. Are numbers helpful in making your case? Is that kind of what you're...
Well, no, I'm saying if you believe that God conceived of each individual who's born, then maybe God wanted 10 million or maybe 55 million or maybe 60 million of those people to live, because the country would be what God wants it to be.
Okay, good. So you notice tonight that I didn't use a single biblical text. Right. Now, I'm happy to do that, but for someone who doesn't take the biblical text as authoritative, maybe they might take it as wisdom literature. That's great. But I would try to give you a case without appealing necessarily to the Bible or necessarily appealing to God. This is not just a religious issue. There's actually a group called Atheists for Life. Yeah. So it would be a mistake to reduce it to a religious issue. I would say, as it says in Deuteronomy, that choose life, but that God does not want us to end life unjustly. So the question again goes back to, what is it, and do we have appropriate justification to end its life? Does that make sense? And the numbers are important. The reason I didn't use the numbers tonight is because I wanted to make a case to focus on what it is, and not, because the numbers can be, you can show that if this is the case, there's millions of persons who have been lost. And, well, I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, youth group. Be brave. Anybody? Questions from the youth group.
We can talk about drums too.
Talk about drums. We have a drummer. Oh, is he out?
Oh, he left.
He lost.
He
the
walked
drummer.
out on me. I'm so hurt.
Any question at all from the youth group?
You guys got to have some kind of questions.
Yeah.
Now you don't have to go to college. Right?
There
You don't have to take my. You don't have to take my class. I think it's good. I might want to make one point is that it's important to not just hear it, but be able to reverbalize it. And like I would talk to my friend who listened to the talk tonight and say, okay, what did you hear? How did you hear the arguments? Let's talk about those. And then see if we can be someplace where we, pair up, not to destroy someone else's argument, but to see what they would say. Hey, we're just asking this question. Is abortion ever justified? What would be your answer? Tell me your reason, right? And then go have spaghetti. We have to be able to have some lightness to it on the intellectual side.
Have a question.
I know someone that said if you make abortion illegal, then people will just do it illegally and less safe, and I don't know what to tell them. So
Can you? I missed the first part, just where the speakers are. And I'm a drummer. I can't hear.
I know someone that said if you make abortion illegal, people will do it illegally and unsafely. So I don't know what to tell them about that.
Mm-hmm. Very good question. That's one of the ones that come up, and that's an appeal to pity, right? If you make, would we say that about robbery? Like, if can you repeat the question?
The question was a great question. So, if we make it illegal, then there's going to be dangerous abortions that will either take place in back alleys. It's the back alley argument, or they'll go across the state, or they can't get access because they're poor and they're going to hurt themselves. So that's the major idea of the question.
Okay. So recognize that this is an appeal to pity. It does touch us in our emotion and compassion, right? We don't want to needlessly make people unequal, these sorts of things. And if people are hurting themselves, well, we take steps to help people not hurt themselves. However, and remember, I'm taking this intellectually, so it may not initially be emotionally satisfying. So just think about that for a moment. What I would say is, if we're having a lot of people who are robbing convenience stores, they're getting hurt. So let's make it more safe for them to rob the convenience stores. Right? Are you calling pregnant women who want to end their abortion robbers? No, that's not the way the analogy works. It says, it's trying to focus on, if we're doing something wrong, we don't enable others to do it if they're getting hurt while they're doing it. Does that, I know she's writing it down, but does that make some sense, right? What people will do is they will hear you calling the person that's in a crisis pregnancy a robber. That's not the analogy, that's not the argument. It's to focus on, the question is, what is it? And what we're doing to it, is it right or wrong? Right? So if it's something that's good or right, well then, yeah, we don't want people to get hurt doing it, right? If someone's fixing light bulbs and they're constantly getting electrocuted, well, we need to fix that. But that's not a bad thing, arguably. So you want to say, well, look, we need to talk about whether or not this is a good or bad thing. Then we can address that issue. Right? It's, can I eat this? Can I play with this kind of question?
That's really good. All right, who's next?
When you use these arguments, I've used a few of them. I've come across individuals who are just full of just terrible anger and rage when you challenge them. How do you deal with that? I mean, it's hard to be loving and caring, but you want to be, but at the same time, they shut down because of this terrible rage and anger. How would you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we just don't have to deal with that on this issue. It'd be others too, right? I mean, it could just be two friends or spouses arguing with one another, or quarreling, I like to say, because I think arguments are good. how do we deal with someone who's that emotionally charged? One of the ways to do it is to kindly and gently just go, wow, you got to meet them where they're at emotionally and go, wow, this seems like a really weighty and big issue for you. I'm sensing just a ton of emotion here. Can you just help me understand, where's all that emotion coming from? Is it coming from hurt, or is it coming, you're mad at certain people because they're harming others? I want to know where that emotion is coming from. And many times, people aren't self-aware of their level of intensity. And we can talk about something that we really know about and that we're passionate about. Could be a game, could be a sport, and we're into it, and our intensity gets way up there, and our voices get loud, and we don't realize we're intense, right? It's like, wow, you really must like baseball, right? Or you must really like that game, But I think engaging their emotion. I used to work for Disneyland Hotel. What they always taught us, I used to manage restaurants, and when someone had a really bad food, or I walked up one time and a customer had a cockroach sitting on top of the salad. Literally. And he goes, and he's like, I'm paying hundreds of dollars for this meal, and he just starts to ratchet it up. And I go, meet his intensity. Oh, man, I am so sorry. How does dessert sound for you? Free. And meeting them where they're at, I think, is important. They need to be recognized for their intensity, even whether or not it's justified at the moment. I mean, some people get out of bounds, and we just, maybe need not to enter the conversation. But that's how I would deal with it. I had someone yell at me when I was on my way walking into church. They were literally waiting for me, and they walked up and just started yelling at me. And so what I did is I just started talking softly. And I said, what's wrong? And then I said, I would love to talk to you about this. And she leaned over, and everyone's around, and she's like, oh, I'm getting a little intense here. So.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you were mentioning that Iceland, is that where you said?
Mhm.
Okay. So they were only able to identify, obviously, that one subset of children that they were no longer
Down syndrome.
because of the chromosome. So,
Mhm.
but do you know, are there other countries or other places where they're trying to?
Yes, you have instances where, for instance, and you can even just engage this as a thought experiment. What if we can identify, and we actually can, eye color, sex, color of skin, these types of things. We can identify those things prior to being born. Do those properties justify ending a life? So that's the question. And, we have parents right now who want to give, for kids who are short, but they want them to play basketball or that, it's banned in certain places, but to give them growth hormones so they would have a better chance, but we don't know all the side effects to those things. Should parents be involved in doing those things? That's I think, a very weighty question, and one that we probably would say, no, we should just be comfortable or get comfortable in our own skin, whether we're short, tall, whatever. So yes, that's happening. It happens mainly when sex is identified, male, female, those types of things. But I like to raise it with my friends who are a part of, they may be identify as bisexual, they might identify in various ways. I ask them if they're pro-abortion, would you be okay with if a couple identified that position that they're going to be in life and then had them aborted based off of that? I would be against it. I think we all should be. But we need to have a dialogue.
I just can't believe that mainstream, we're not hearing about that.
Yeah, how come you didn't hear about Gosnell? You can watch the movie, but you can just read about his case. And both a pro-life person and a pro-choice person could walk hand in hand and say, whoa, this is a really bad situation. And then why is it so grievous? right? And then we're back at talking about, well, what is the unborn? What are the born? What is it, and what justifies taking life? But we didn't hear about Gosnell. Why? Why does it get filtered out? We should ask ourselves those questions. In philosophy, we talk about Plato's cave, being in a cave and not seeing true beauty, goodness in that. Maybe today, in some ways, even though we have unprecedented access to information, we're back in Plato's cave, and we're not really getting access to those things.
Very good. So where would one get those growth hormones? And is it okay? Who's next? And is there an age limit?
I thought you were going to make me take short hormones.
We could do that too, because you guys are all abnormal. I'm the only.
I have two quick questions. One, I saw this lady online, and she talks to college kids about abortion. And Pastor Josh asked about the clump of cells argument. Well, what she does is say, are you a clump of cells as well? Would that be a good argument to, push back on somebody, like to let them think about it? Because they're minimizing a clump of cells, but when you put it back on them, maybe it's saying, you are too. You're exactly that as well.
You're kind of a clump of cells that talks very well too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can come back with retorts like that, and they can be appropriate. I'm just suggesting we be careful in which context and how we do that, because I would rather steer the conversation. If someone says, "Well, it's just a clump of cells," I can give a quippy response to that, but I would want to say, "Well, is that true?"
Mm-hmm.
Just simply, is it true? Because I want to know the truth. It's not me against you and you against me. It's us putting our arms around each other and going, that's the problem or the issue. How do we solve it? So we're not adversaries. I'm trying to make it. And I want to know, is it true? Then it's a factual claim, not a moral claim. Is it factual as a clump of cells? And even doctors, when they go to take a clump of cells from you to do tests, they ask you, don't they? Yeah. So we just don't do things to people usually without asking. So, but first we want to ask, is it true? And then that's a factual claim, not a moral claim. And then we can ask the moral claim. So let's look at the scientific evidence and talk about that.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And if someone is pro-choice, I think it's a good idea for them to actually see a video of an abortion so they can either make that decision, because unless you see it, how do you know what it actually is? And it's very difficult, I think, people to actually conceptualize what's going on. But watching one, it's a whole nother story. I feel like breaking through the computer and rescuing the baby when I see something like that. So I'm just, would you recommend that to somebody?
What I recommend, whenever we use visuals, we let people know what they're going to see. I'm not for springing something on someone to get a gotcha situation. So the first thing I say is, notice what I did with you. I said, does anyone know about embryoscopy? And you raised your hand. And then I described what it is. So you knew intellectually and emotionally what you were going to engage with. And I gave you a description, right? So I think visuals are important in the moral life. Look what we did in World War II. A lot of people denied that there were concentration camps. And we had to show pictures and show people the devastation. To this day, we take students to the Museum of Tolerance, right, or the Holocaust Museum. And what strikes you many times at first is that visual content. But we let them know what we're going to go see. We don't spring it on them like, hey, get in the bus. Museum of Tolerance, not Disneyland. That would be weird, right? We want to make sure we don't do that. Now, what that does, and you can purchase the content. It's the Endowment for Human Development. Okay. What it does, it gives a womb a window. It gives a womb a window, and most likely, and this would be an interesting question to ask God, why didn't He make wombs with windows? And maybe He would answer, and this is not, who knows, but I'd like to speculate about these things. This is what I do at night. He might say, well, people wouldn't dare think about doing these types of things until the 21st century or the 20th century. So it wasn't needed, maybe, or there's other scientific reasons why that would be the case. But I think it does impact people both emotionally. Then we want to make sure we bring some of that intellectual content to connect with it.
I know that this is a moral, ethical, philosophical conversation. And you even mentioned there's atheists that are on our side of the camp on this because they're thinking about it morally. As believers, should we play the Imago Dei card? Should we, the image of God, that we're image bearers and there's a quickening of the spirit at the point of conception? Is that, I know it's different for each person, but that's an added belief that we have and hold.
Oh, yeah. Here's the way I like to put it. That's a great point. I like to say, for me as a Christian philosopher, or just a Christian, I think I have resources that help me recognize and both cherish life in the way it's meant to be. So right now, some of the arguments depict the developing human embryo, fetus, and that as a attacker on the woman's body, right? These are some arguments. So you have to stop the attacker. So it's put in an opposition. Rather, I would want to describe from a biblical standpoint or a Christian standpoint that women are the guardians of life. You like the guardians of the galaxy, right? You are the guardians of life. Wow. That's cool, right? And if we can give people hope, let them see that there's joy there, that there's love there, I think playing the Imago Dei card is great. We have a scholar community member named Dr. Joe Miller. He has these shirts that have, in Hebrew, something like "in the image of God" or "made in the image of God" or "I'm in the image of God, prove me wrong." Oh, this is a great starter. What's that Hebrew saying you have on your shirt? Oh, it means I'm created in the image of God. That means all human beings are valuable. No matter their size, no matter their level of development, no matter their environment, no matter their degree of dependency. There's the sled right there. Boom, you're into it.
All right. Anybody else?
We had one over here, I think.
Yep. Chris.
You were supposed to be first.
I had a spiritual question. I know that since Roe versus Wade, I believe that was 1973.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And they've estimated in our country that there's been 60 million abortions in the last 50 years. So and I personally am pro-choice, but if life begins at conception, could we say there's 60 million babies in heaven in the last 50 years? I've always wondered about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. Christians have an in-house debate on that, on what view to take. So, and it's interesting and weighty. Some would think that there's an age of accountability to where we have to grow to a certain point where we're actually accountable to our actions. We're self-aware of what's going on. So someone prior to that they don't have any accountability or duties at that point. So God would have them enter into his presence, is what you might say. Others have argued, and it may not be emotionally satisfying, but they have argued that if God is all-knowing, He knows what every person would do in any given situation, so He knows what that person would have chosen given their particular situation. I'm not as in favor of that view, but that is another answer, right? and I would ask, and I'm not necessarily directing it to you, if someone is pro-choice and you also look at their worldview, that's a great time to ask those kinds of things. Well, what happens to people when they die? Now you're in a very interesting discussion about worldview, about religion, and you can start to build a bridge. Because I think really, and this may really take you off on a different path, that the abortion issue really isn't about abortion. The abortion issue is really about sexual ethics. It's about sex. And the choices and the consequences that are connected with the choices about sex. And that's where the debate really is, in my opinion. We don't like to forestall our desires.
That's true. All right, one more question.
I think.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks for being here, by the way. I mean, love to have the discussion.
Yeah, on position 3, where you said qualified yes, like
Mhm.
you didn't I don't remember you diving like too deep into that. I would like to know kind of more what that position would look
Sure.
like.
Qualified no says there's a few, 1, 2, 3 instances where you are justified in taking the life of the unborn human person. Cases where we call ectopic pregnancy, where the embryo basically gets stuck in the pipes, if you will. Other cases are where the woman contracts cancer, and if she undergoes cancer treatment, it will kill the developing fetus or the embryo. And I think arguably a woman is not obligated to withhold treatment in that instance. It would be justified for her to have the treatment, even though it ends up killing the unborn human person in that case. Does that make sense? So the qualified yes opens that up a lot more. It says there's probably 10 cases or 12. It can be different according to the person, where we have to allow for instances of abortion. And a lot of those will be appeals to pity in that case. Did I answer your question appropriately?
Yeah. Also, what kind of drums do you like?
There we go. And we'll end on that one.
I want to tell you. I mean, all excited. I play an old Tama Superstar kit that I bought in the 80s, and I also have a 1950s Slingerland kit that my dad played on, because my dad was a drummer. And then, so those, I like the Tama Superstar kits, and also their, I think they call Star Classics. They sound really good. But today, we're blessed. There are so many good drum sets that it used to be the case that most people didn't have access to instruments. It was rare. But we are so blessed that we have so much access to the various kinds of instruments. We have an opportunity to create so much beauty. And hopefully that's a little bit of what tonight is ultimately about, is creating beauty in the world. Being guardians of life.
I like that.
I need to make shirts.
My goodness. I think I could have gone another hour for sure. I think we're just going to have you back. Thank you guys for joining us tonight. Next week, Aliens. Be lots of fun.
Yeah, Jeff's great.
Yeah, dress
Highly
up.
recommend it.
If you like what we're doing here at the church on having the scholars come in, put your money where your mouth is. Drop some cash in that box back there. And that way we can kick it to Reasons to Believe. You can also give directly to Reasons to Believe through their website. You might be able to get there through that QR code. But at least you can get a free book through that QR code.
Yes, get a book.
So,
or give it to someone.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much. I'm sure George will hang around for any more questions. God bless you. Go in peace. And I hope you learned something.
Thank you.